Okay, we're recording. Okay, so I'm back again after a bit of a break, reading from The Eye of the Eye, from which nothing is hidden. I think it was about 3 months ago I did chapter 3. So it's early days. So we're on section 2 now, the spiritual process. And today I'm reading chapter 4, the basics. So the subheading is Religion as a Source of Spiritual Error. There are two sources of error stemming from traditional true religions. The first is simply misunderstanding or misinterpretation of the specific teachings of the original great teacher. Because the original listeners or followers were not themselves enlightened, the original teachings were contaminated by their egos. This then became magnified by subsequent translators and scribes down through the generations. The warp often is due to the fact that the ego has a tendency to be literal in its hearing of the word, rather than the spirit or essence of a teaching. Any translation that teaches anything other than peace or love is in error. This is a basic rule and easy to spot. The second and more prevalent gross distortions are spiritual teachings that arise from what is usually referred to as church doctrine. These regulations, often in the form of guilt-provoking prohibitions, were actually totally made up by the church officials and supposed authorities who, in reality, had no claim to authority at all, but instead had acquired political power in the structure of the institutions at the time. There is no authentic or plausible reason to modify the precise teaching of an original great teacher for some ostensible gain. As obvious as it may seem, it has not been clear through the centuries that to be a Christian, for example, means simply to exactly follow Christ's teachings. All the great teachers teach non-violence, non-condemnation, and unconditional love. It is hard to see how any alleged ecclesiastical authority could violate those basic truisms, supposedly for the good of the faith, or the good of the church, or the elimination of infidelities, or just wars. There are many subjects not addressed in original spiritual teachings, thus creating the opportunity for fallacious religious elaborations. All kinds of sins have been invented over the centuries with elaborate explanations and rationalizations that can only be described clinically as rather sick manipulations of natural human affairs. The harm that resulted was not only spiritual error, but also psychological cruelty and the blanket guilt of humanity. This focus on guilt and sin further condemns human consciousness by reinforcing the dilemma of the opposites and the duality of perception. This latter destructive effect on human consciousness takes man farther away from God and creates a barrier that is transcended only by the very few who have to be almost spiritual geniuses in order to succeed in escaping the coercive trap of elaborate fallacies. A further destructive effect of the promulgations of some religious doctrine is that it creates the very basis for terrible wars and persecutions. These are always based on religious differences that are exaggerated in importance in order to justify religiously sanctioned mayhem. These misinterpretations and deviations are especially notable in the murky religious meddlings with sexuality, procreation, child rearing, diet, details of daily living, customs, dress, and political power. Wearing different kinds of clothing, hats, or facial hair is enough to fuel religious persecution or war. Circumcision, not eating meat on Fridays, saying grace before meals, and dates and details of religious holidays all become ammunition. Whether the Sabbath is Saturday or Sunday becomes more important than the truth. Whether wearing a hat or no hat shows respect for God, becomes a hoary issue. By exploiting trivialities at the cost of ignoring the main thrust of spiritual truth, religions contribute to their own downfall, and that of all humanity. Much that is revered as church doctrine is really the product of the ego. If it is true, as Jesus said, that evil is in the eye of the beholder, then those who see sin and evil everywhere are themselves the problem. In Victorian times, even the leg of a table was considered to be a temptation and had to be discreetly covered with a drape. Much of what has traditionally been described as sin is really the guilt-ridden exaggerations held in the mind of some emotionally disturbed church authority. Adherence to the admonition, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," would silence all these misappropriations of spiritual truth. Collectively, these distortions of spiritual truth have paradoxically condemned both God and human nature in the name of divinity. To usurp that authority and make pronouncements in the name of God seems rather grandiose and delusional. No one who had ever experienced the absolute reality of the presence of God could ever make such distorted statements. So, a subheading of the emancipation of humanity. Before a new direction is sought, it is necessary to discern the error of the old and awaken a desire to transcend that error. This requires courage and fearless honesty. The recovery from many serious and incurable, potentially fatal disorders is based on the willingness and capacity to face the truth and choose a different pathway. To break down denial and admit the truth takes one above the critical line of integrity at 200. The phoenix of spiritual awakening is birthed out of the ashes of human despair. As Mother Teresa said, "The beautiful flower, the lotus, arises from its roots in the slime and mud at the bottom of the pond." Early in this writer's life, there occurred the revelation of the totality of the suffering of all of mankind. It was staggering and overwhelming in its sheer immensity. As stated elsewhere, this led, unfortunately, to the mistake of blaming all that suffering of humanity on the God of religion who had allowed all that to take place. However, it did reinforce the drive and desire to relieve human suffering. Many years later, the resultant atheist, without warning and at the depth of despair, surrendered to God and had a profound spiritual awakening that transformed all understanding of God, truth, and reality. Yet, some years later came the vision and comprehension of the profound ignorance and limitation of human consciousness that revealed itself as the very foundation and source of all human suffering. The realization of the immensity of the hold of ignorance on, and its a terrible price to humanity, was profound and resulted in a shifting of endeavour from relieving physical and mental sickness and suffering to the spiritual error that accounted for all of it. The collective human ego, as expressed by society, is blind to the basic problem that underlies its own suffering. Typical of the ego is its belief that the problems to be addressed are out there, and therefore all the social programs, including wars, are devoted to fixing them or fixing out there. The basic problem with humanity is that the human mind is incapable of discerning truth from falsehood. It cannot tell good from evil. With no means of self-protection, humans are at the mercy of falsehood in all its beguiling disguises that parade as patriotism, religion, and the social good, harmless entertainment, etc. With a simple at-home test of true-false, all the dictators, emperors, and demagogues of history would have fallen. If one simply places a picture of Hitler in a manila envelope and has a child hold it over their solar plexus, the child's arm goes weak. The same telltale weakness reveals the true nature of Stalin, Lenin, the Arab zealot leaders, communism, and the lethal leaders of Cambodia and African countries, and dictators who hide behind the name of Allah. All the slaughters of mankind down through the centuries have been the result of force, to which the only antidote is power. Force is based on falsehood. Power is based solely on truth. Evil loses its hold when it is revealed, that is, its vulnerable weak side, its Achilles heel, which is exposed to everyone. Falsity collapses when it is exposed for what it is. It does not take the US government, the CIA, the FBI, spy satellites, or computers to discern the obvious. The arm of the innocent 5-year-old child has the only real might on earth. The power of truth itself is invincible and requires no sacrifice. So the subheading is the arm of the child. It is the arm of innocence that the dark legions of the world fear most of all, for it unmasks the disguises by which they hold sway over 78% of the world's population. If one drops denial, one will see that falsehood, manipulation, and distortion of truth cater prevalently to man's lowest propensities and pervade all society. The popular computer games are neither innocent nor harmless. They are calculated killing training machines to deaden the spiritual sensitivity by conditioning the mind to thoughtless maiming and killing. The deliberate killing of prairie dogs is not sport, but callous mayhem. Drugs are not cool, but enslaving. Heavy metal, rock, and rap music are neither liberating nor amusing. They are a deliberate mode by which to entrain the consciousness of youth. The media pretend innocence as they take and rake in the high profits that stem from catering to man's lowest weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The innocent child's arm is frightening to the vast establishments that draw their attraction from ignorance. The fallacious war on drugs is revealed to be the very cause of the problem and the bulwark of the whole drug trade that it created, empowered, and enriched. Communism was not defeated by war, but by the non-violence of Gorbachev. The rebirth of Christ, the great heralded second coming from a spiritual viewpoint, means the displacement of falsehood by truth, of darkness by light, of ignorance by awareness. The significance of Krishna, Buddha, Christ, and Allah was not their personal presence on the planet, but the truths they revealed and espoused, and the calibratable high energy that accompanied the teachings. An enlightened being tells the populace to ignore their personality or personhood, but instead to focus on the teachings. Typical of the misunderstandings and distortions that prevail in religion, mankind does just the opposite and worships the personages, the dates, the times, and the places they visited, and ignores the teachings. The prevalence of the teaching of the Christ, Buddha, Krishna avatar seems to have been signalled recently by the transition of the consciousness level of mankind from the negative realm of 190 to cross over the line of truth and integrity of 200 to its present level of 207. The significance of this major event, which has happened for the first time in the history of mankind, cannot be understated. By analogy, we know that just on the physical level, a change of only a few degrees in the prevailing global temperature has profound effects on the entire planet and all life on it. In contrast, the shift of man's consciousness from 190 to 207 is far more significant and profound in its total and eventual effects than any change in the temperature of the planet. If the second coming of Christ is to be revealed by a sign, then that sign has already and only very recently appeared. Unmistakable in its implication and promise for all mankind is that profound shift from falsehoods distorting the consciousness of mankind to that of truth. It could be that the arm of a child can reveal to us the first light of a new dawn for civilization. It was said that it will be by the innocence of the child that man is led to God and to heaven. It is actually only by the innocence of the child within that the door to truth can be opened. The innocence of the child remains undisturbed and unsullied within the consciousness of everyone. It is the very basic structure of consciousness itself. The analogy to current life is that the hardware is unsullied by the software, which is processed through the computer, just as the camera is unaffected by the images transmitted through its lens. So, a subtitle of Rediscovery of the Pristine State. While we speculate about the limitations of the consciousness of mankind, it is actually the individual who transforms society in a manner that is invisible and unsuspected. Force is vulnerable to an infinite number of oppositions, but power has no possible opposite or enemy. Like space itself, power is immune to attack and forever invulnerable. People think they are ruled by their unruly minds and that they are the victims of circumstances. All this sums up how a person feels from moment to moment. Thus, people see themselves as victims of their stream of consciousness, or feeling states and transitory circumstances. The prevailing view is that there are no options to one's current state of mind and feeling tone or emotions. This succumbing to it, the mind, and out there, the world, is accepted as natural and normal. Few people suspect that there is actually any other option. By self-examination and inward focus, one can discover that all states of consciousness are the result of the execution of an option. They are not unchangeable certainties determined by uncontrolled factors at all. This can be discovered by examining how the mind works. One is not really ruled by the mind at all. What the mind reveals is an endless stream of options, all disguised as memories, fantasies, fears, concepts, etc. To get free of domination by the mind, it is only necessary to realize that its parade of subjects is merely an arbitrary cafeteria of selections, wending their way across the screen of the mind. One is not forced to feel resentment by a negative memory, nor does one have to buy into a fearful thought about the future. These are only options. The mind is like a television set running its various channels for selection, and one does not have to follow any particular temptation of thought. One can fall into the temptation of feeling sorry for oneself, or angry, or worried. The secret attraction of all these options is that they offer an inner payoff, or a secret satisfaction, which is the source of the attraction of the mind's thoughts. If these payoffs are refused, it will be discovered that at all times behind the thought screen, there is a silent, invisible, thought-free space of joy. This is an option that is always available, but to be experienced, it has to be chosen above all other tempting options. The source of joy is always present, always available, and not dependent on circumstances. There are only two obstacles. One, the ignorance that it is always available and present, and two, valuing something other than peace and joy above that peace and joy because of the secret pleasure of the payoff. The experience of the presence of God is available and within at all times, but awaits choice. That choice is made only by surrendering everything other than peace and love to God. In return, the divinity of the self reveals itself as ever present, but not experienced, because it has been ignored or forgotten, or one has chosen otherwise. So the next subheading is, when is the future? To choose to experience the presence of God occurs outside time. It is therefore nowhere in the future. It is available only in the present. No other condition is necessary or even possible because the present moment is permanent. It never changes. It never disappears into yesterday or tomorrow. In fact, it is inescapable. Everyone is actually safe in the exact moment of now. By observation, it will become apparent that the only thing that seems to change is appearance. The now stands still. The screen is permanent. Although a movie script changes and a story unfolds, even then it can only do so within the precise instant of now. Nowness is the primordial, overreaching, all-powerful, unchangeable and absolute requirement to experiencing. It is the essence of awareness of being and existence. It is impossible to exist anywhere at all except in the drastic, radical reality of now. This instant is all there is. One's own consciousness as self is the only I by which anything can be experienced or known. The inner sense of reality is bestowed by the self on the outer surroundings, which is what makes them seem real. The sense of realness is therefore a projection of consciousness by the self, originating from the self. One is therefore not the witness of a real world, one is actually the source of its seeming reality. The world is actually entertainment. Like amusement, it is meant to be worn lightly. Heaven is within and is revealed by awareness. The world is merely an appearance. Its melodrama is an artifice of the distorted sense of perception. It leads one to think that the world is large, powerful and permanent, and that the self is small, weak and transitory. Exactly the opposite is true. Without belief in its appearance as defined by perception, the world we thought was real disappears. When one chooses to be at one with the inner, ever-present potentiality of joy and peace, the world transforms into a humorous amusement park, and all the drama is seen to be just drama. The option for truth, peace and joy is always available, although seemingly buried behind an ignorance and non-awareness that results from having chosen other options as a habit or thought. The inner truth reveals itself when all other options are refused by surrender to God. So another subheading, the human condition as an altered state of consciousness. A fact or truth is not established by the fact of commonality, as history demonstrates profoundly. Falsehood is most commonly the pervasive human experience. One of the most significant discoveries in consciousness research is that what is commonly understood and accepted as normal human experience in thought, behaviour and feeling is technically merely an altered state of consciousness that prevails in a limited stratum of society for a limited duration. It is actually not man's real state. Man is so used to worry, fear, anxiety, remorse, guilt, conflict, and distress that they are accepted as normal life, with negative emotions, attitudes, and feelings. Mankind, the patient, is advised to seek a therapist to get in touch with their feelings, rather than getting in touch with these fermentations of illusion. It would be more beneficial to liquidate them by uncovering their source as perception itself. A truly normal state of consciousness is one that is free of all negativity and instead filled with joy and love. Anything else is based on illusion and perceptual distortions. Because disease prevails in a society does not mean that disease is a normal condition. Throughout history, such things have prevailed in society and, in fact, have killed off large proportions or large portions of the population. But that does not mean they are a natural condition. Even the Black Plague eventually disappeared. By simple means, it can be discovered that 78% of the world's population is actually disturbed. That means that only 22% of the population is out of the extreme danger zone of the calibrated levels of consciousness below 200. We tend to think of an altered state of consciousness as an artificially produced paranormal state, or something similar to a hypnotic state or trance, or as being programmed or brainwashed. From a study of the pervasive influences that act by the repetitive entrainment of man's levels of consciousness, it becomes obvious that the mind of mankind meets the criteria of having been controlled, influenced, and brainwashed in a systematic and continuous manner that is in accord with the definition of such processes in scientific research. A child is born with the innocence of an unprogrammed consciousness, but then, like the hardware of a computer, it is systematically programmed with software, which is society's input. This system has one glaring and all-important defect, however. There is no program in place or available to ascertain the truth or falsehood of the new software programs. It is much like a computer virus. The child will innocently believe anything it is told. The unprotected consciousness of the child then becomes prey to the collective ignorance, misinformation, and fallacious belief that systems that have blighted man's capacity for happiness for the last millennia. The programming that ensues is actually uncorrectable, as there has been no mechanism available to test the authenticity of the material with which the child's mind is programmed. On the surface, it would seem that up to 78% of the data will not only be fallacious, but destructive and damaging. This is superimposed on a human brain that is already genetically defective to begin with. Over 1/3 of the population has a brain that does not even supply enough of the neurotransmitter serotonin to keep the individual from being depressed, overeating, addictive, or being out of behavioural control. The capacity for reason itself can be completely destroyed in an instant by an uncontrollable burst of emotion. Rationality is further undermined by the biological fact that the old reptile and animal brain is still anatomically and functionally present, and its atavistic activity continues to exert a pervasive animal instinct that strengthens predatory tendencies and aggression. All the instincts of the animal persist and influence or even dominate much of the behavioural and feeling states. The emotions of the animal are ever present and close to the surface. These tendencies are themselves vulnerable to training and manipulation by social programming and propaganda. Man, therefore, starts out with a biologically defective brain with instincts of the animal, and his intelligence and information are then systematically downgraded and programmed with data that is inaccurate, fallacious, destructive, negative, and damaging, at least 78% of the time. That is just a statistical probability for mankind as a whole. But within society, there are vast populations where the percentage of fallacious material comes close to 100%, e.g., criminal, street gang subcultures, etc. Often, what is most damaging is that the error in programming pertains to very critical behavioral elements. The total productivity of whole nations and cultures can be subverted to destructive ends. The whole economy of entire nations such as Germany and Japan during World War II was subverted to mass destruction, not only of innocent victims, but also of their very own culture. Whole countries can be reduced to rubble by propaganda that is so ignorant and fallacious that one wonders in retrospect how anyone could have been gullible enough to buy it, much less sacrifice their lives for it. The simple muscle test instantly reveals the truth. Dictators make everyone go weak. E.g., Hirohito is revealed as not divine, Caesar is not God, etc. Society has no safeguard other than teaching the population a simple test of truth that anyone can do anywhere in a moment. If this simple test were widely known, it would have a total uplifting effect on mankind. The very simplicity of the test, along with its wide benefit and availability, puts it in the same class as the inventions of the wheel, electricity, or the computer chip. At a cost of zero, mankind can reap unlimited benefits. Perhaps a realization that the test can also be used to reap great profitability would elicit notice and interest. Applied to business, research, manufacturing, and industry, the potential benefits do actually guarantee the savings of literally trillions of dollars. On the other hand, large segments of society have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. As astonishing as it may seem, we live in a society where prosecutors knowingly withhold evidence that would prove the accused innocent in order to get a conviction, even if it means execution. Such incidents are merely symptoms that indicate the degree of severity of the illness of mankind's consciousness. Like the DNA test, the muscle test instantly reveals the guilt or innocence of any accused. It instantly determines the truth or falsehood of any witness or testimony. It instantly reveals the presence or identities of traitors, defectors, foreign agents, informers, cheats, liars, and all forms of renegades. The test reveals, in a matter of seconds or minutes, the identities of industrial or political spies, dishonest employees, drug dealers, dangerous persons, and the location of criminals. It does not take hundreds or thousands of hours of criminal investigation to identify a serial killer or their whereabouts. All crimes are easily solvable. Every detail of a crime or past crimes and events is accurately trackable, including time, date, motive, whereabouts of evidence, identity of perpetrators, etc. The answers to questions such as where is the body, where is the weapon, and what was the motive are answerable. Similarly, as the compass enables navigation, the telescope enables astronomy, and the microscope enables bacteriology. Muscle testing enables one to discover any fact about any subject, anywhere, in space or history within seconds. Muscle testing is a highly versatile tool whose true value is as yet undiscovered. Historical perspective. Throughout history, there has been a plenitude of spiritual teachings and established pathways to God. These are the yogas, or ways that have been traditionally described. Each has developed its own schools, religions, spiritual literature, scriptures, saints, teachers, and historic figures. Historically, these have also absorbed various degrees of ethnicity and remnants of the culture in which they originated. Most of the world's great spiritual traditions have thus become identified with ethnic influences and customs that can be and often are deterrents to or distractions from the inner purity of the teachings themselves. This has led to divisiveness among the world's great religions and has even been the basis for terrible religious wars. Perhaps a renewed study of spiritual truth would transcend these superficial differences and cull the critical essence of all spiritual teachings of merit, no matter what their origin or label. What is a pure spiritual pathway? Actually, until the present time, there was no way to ascertain the truth or falsehood of any spiritual teaching or teacher. Thus, a spiritual student relied on faith in the spiritual integrity of a teacher as revealed by reputation. The only reliable guideline was that by one's inner guidance, no inner grace and karma, one hopefully became involved with an integrous and valid spiritual endeavour. The limitations of the great pathways that originated thousands of years ago were the dearth of the original teachings and caused the progressive loss of what was written through word of mouth. There was also a loss of accuracy in translation from one language to another and misinterpretation by the listeners who themselves were unenlightened. If we use the muscle test to calibrate the level of truth of the world's great religions, we see, as was detailed in the book Power versus Force, that over time there was a general decline in the level of truth of some of those religions. The decline in Buddhism was perhaps the least and relatively small, but in other religions the loss was very considerable. One can easily do a very informative study by researching and calibrating the level of consciousness of each religion, century by century, as well as that of its various interpreters of the times. It is possible by doing so to even pinpoint during which year and by whose dictates the declines occurred. These can often be identified with specific events in which religious decisions were made by ecclesiastical authorities, resulting in dire consequences. The exact nature of the error can also be clearly defined and understood by elucidation of the cultural and political forces of the particular times. Compromises were made that probably seemed justified at the time and were considered to be temporary for the sake of survival, but which had very unfortunate long-term consequences as they were never later corrected. The most grievous and serious example of this was the great decline in the level of truth of Christianity that occurred at the time of the Council of Nicaea. Christianity, which had been in the 900s, dropped over 400 points due to the inclusion of the Old Testament with the New Testament as the Bible, plus the inclusion of the Book of Revelation, which is of astral origin. This was a very devastating error inasmuch as all the books of the Old Testament, with the exception of Genesis, Psalms, and Proverbs, make one go weak with muscle testing, thus indicating that their level of truth is below 200 and therefore untrue. This negativity is due to the anthropomorphic depictions of God as fallible and subject to negative human emotions, such as revenge, hatred, partiality, bargaining, vulnerability, wrath, destruction, pride, and vanity. This angry god of revenge had to be appeased, flattered, assuaged, and bargained with so as not to go on a destructive rampage and cast down storms and floods, fire and pestilence. This was the exact opposite of the God of truth, mercy, and forgiveness that Christ represented. Christ said the God of revenge was to be replaced by the God of mercy and forgiveness. Enemies were to be prayed for and forgiven for their ignorance. This teaching was repudiated by the ancient Hebraic tradition of the God of righteousness, vengeance and favoritism. And it says, see note at the end of this chapter. The ancient gods of primitive cultures. Shall I have a quick look actually, see what that is? If it is there, might not be. Quick look. Oh, right, okay. So the God of righteous vengeance and favoritism. So it says, note on the Christian Holy Bible, King James Version. This Old Testament calibrates at 190, however Genesis is at 660, Psalms at 650, and Proverbs is 350. If these are excluded, then the remaining books collectively calibrate at only 125. The New Testament calibrates at 640. However, if Revelations were removed, it calibrates only at 70. Then the New Testament would calibrate at 790. The current Bible calibrates at 475. To make it authentically holy, as its title implies, it would have to exclude all the books of the Old Testament, except for Genesis, Psalms, and Proverbs, and Revelation. If that were done, then the Bible would be truly holy and calibrate at 740. And it's got a few more points about other Bibles. Well, I won't go through that. Let's get back to the chapter. So, the ancient gods of primitive cultures stem from astral levels of consciousness and are the origin of the Scandinavian, German, Greek, Hebraic, Roman, Egyptian, Babylonian, Incan, and Mayan gods, with their telltale limitations of human passions, motives, positionalities, hatreds, and demands for sacrifice and jealous, angry destruction. That which is truly God has infinite power and has no need to employ the weak manipulation of force. That which is truly divine has no vulnerabilities, needs, or vested interests. Emotionality, selectivity, and the limitations they reveal are not attributes of God, whose presence is innately revealed by love and peace. Negativity originates from the mind of man, who manufactures the endless array of false gods, all of whom demand worship and sacrifice. The God of reality has no needs and is not subject to being pleased or displeased, much less appeased. The severity of the loss of understanding can be appreciated by realizing that the numerical calibrated values are logarithmic. A loss of 100 points represents a vast loss of truth and power. In some religions, these errors were so severe that the fundamentalist branches of these religions fell below the critical level of 200, and the resultant falsehoods being misrepresented as truth had serious consequences in massive suffering and destruction by mankind. The levels below 200 represent suffering in all its forms. One of the main levers that tilted the world in a negative direction was the self-defeating conceptual weapon called righteousness, which calibrates as pride at 190. It has been the primary destructive force and Achilles' heel for the last several thousand years of man's history. It was the great highest excuse for every form of imaginable savagery and barbarism. The truly great historical pathways originated from the avatars or great teachers, whom we have identified as those who calibrate at the level of 1000, which is the maximum possibility in the earthly domain. Best known in the Western world are the names of Christ, Buddha, Krishna, and Zoroaster. The level of 1000 is concerned with the salvation of all mankind. Thus, a spiritual teacher who is addressing all mankind is speaking from the level of the avatar. The great avatars lived before the printed word was available, and thus there is a paucity of reliable data as to exactly what was taught and how it was interpreted. Because there are few explanations of what was originally meant, misinterpretations readily occurred as the original teaching was handed down. We can readily ascertain that error did creep in and distort the original purity. Many of these deviations are quite blatant and readily apparent to anyone with any spiritual intuition or even a basic sense of ethics. The distortions seem to have occurred with the establishment of religions and when authoritative institutions took the name of their ostensible founders in order to give themselves authority and power, to attract followers and worldly assets, and to gain control over others. Spirituality as such has no argument with anyone, and the misinterpretations that split off as dogmatic ecclesiastical bodies did so to empower themselves and exploit the misinterpretations as spiritual truth in order to gain worldly advantage. By doing so, they forsook power for force and undermined the truth as set forth by the founders, who, historically, then became founders in name only. The status and prestige of the original avatar, the great name, was then stolen and merchandised in order to build great empires. With this short historical perspective, one can see that the original truth remains unsullied to this very day and can be rediscovered. The word spiritual, like religion and God, has become so overdescribed as to be misleading. A more comprehensive term, which avoids historical distortions and encompasses all available and possible information about man and God, is consciousness. Spirituality properly refers to those aspects of consciousness that pertain to the awareness of truth and divinity, and includes all references to the absolute and all-present reality, which is the source and infinite domain of all that exists as existence itself. In that definition, consciousness includes all possibilities and realities in their totality, and it is the very space and matrix in which awareness progresses to its ultimate potentiality. We can safely and accurately validate this pathway, at least up to the calibrated consciousness level of 1000, at which point the illusion of a separate seeker will have already dissolved. The teachings of every great spiritual teacher who ever lived are now available for inspection and even detailed calibration and verification. The consciousness level of 600 denotes the level at which duality disappears into non-duality. It is at this point that a bridge between the seen and the unseen, the known and the unknown, the ordinary and the possible can be approached. At the level of 600, spirit and man meet. The visible and the invisible diffuse into each other. It is a reference point to serve as a guide. It is the level of enlightenment. Curiously enough, the muscle test of truth itself calibrates at the level of 600, and therefore is the physical expression of the meeting of the realms of duality and non-duality. The study of the nature of consciousness is perhaps the most powerful and pure of all spiritual pathways, because it becomes self-correcting and self-propelling. The literature about consciousness and spirituality easily leads to error, and thus today's serious seeker of enlightenment excludes all teachings whose truth cannot be verified objectively. Consciousness levels from 500 up to 1000 really denote what could be described as different realms or dimensions. The spiritual teachers in the high 500s are the ones who have the most contact with significant numbers of people. By the time their spirituality evolved, consciousness reaches 700, they become less available and more legendary, and their legacy consists of their recorded teachings. We could typify human life as various fields and levels of human consciousness talking to each other and seeing people as impersonal spokespersons for these various levels. Thus, the disparaging of religion or spirituality by the hardcore materialistic scientist is not really a personal view, but merely an expression of the energy field, the 400s, with their inherent limitations as well as capabilities. In the lower 400s, particularly, there is often an egotism about the intellect, reason, and intellectualization. In the 400s, therefore, God is replaced by science as the font of all knowledge and the hope for the future. Just going to plug directly, just in case. Yeah, we're on. Okay. In the 300s, political becomes the hope for man's salvation, and wars are fought over political ideologies, labels, and slogans, with their degradation of the value of individual human life. Bad people are eliminated by the guillotine and the electric chair, or put in prisons. At this level, there is the dualistic preoccupation with the limited realm of right versus wrong, with its innate blindness to the positionality that creates such a dichotomy. The lower levels live in a chaotic world, because definitions of right or wrong vary from moment to moment, from culture to culture, and within the culture itself, depending on education, IQ, social mores, or geography. This level is very vulnerable to the news media, which exploits it to the maximum and milks the public with sentimentality and maudlin emotionality. This propensity to either orness persists in the 400s as scientific versus non-scientific. Thus, science itself is the home of a mechanistic reductionism and determinism that is held with the prevailing dogma, which rivals that of the Church of the Middle Ages. By the consciousness level of the 500s, the tendency to get caught in the innate limitations and ignorance of the opposites diminishes, and such fallacies lessen their grip on the mind. In the 500s, spirit in the form of love begins to dissolve these hardened extremes, and humanism and situational ethics that take context into account emerge to bring about greater balance and a sense of ethics to counteract extremism. Okay. The level of the heart, at 500, becomes the bridge from secularism, hardcore righteousness, and vindictive moralism, and opens the door for consideration of alternate views, benevolence, mercy, and forgiveness through understanding and non-judgment. The great power of the 500s is in the use of the faculty of understanding, and it is understanding that allows for the progression to 540, the level of unconditional love. In these levels, there is the capacity to differentiate the act from the actor. Thus, the mother visits her convicted son in prison and continues to love him despite his having committed a horrible crime. In the 500s also, there is a capacity to realize man's limitations and inability to rise above them. The capacity and the willingness to forgive them, for they know not what they do, becomes a realizable goal in benevolence, as benevolence replaces the desire for retribution, revenge, and counter-aggression. Forgiveness thus becomes the keystone. In the 500s, the limitations of the capacity of choice become obvious. The child within everyone comes into view, and its innermost primordial innocence becomes more visible and tends to preclude the use of retaliation, which, in our society, often takes the same form or worse than that of the crime which is being punished. In the 500s, there is also the capacity to see all actions as the result of a multitude of contributing factors, so that responsibility is now seen as being present or possible only to varying degrees, depending on context and conditions. Behaviour takes on shades of meaning, and knee-jerk oversimplifications are no longer acceptable. Snap judgments cease, and the various paradoxes are weighed and considered. It becomes comprehensible that things do not happen against a person's will, but only by a concurrence of one's own current or prior spiritual positions with the choices one has made. Life in all its expressions is seeing this as opportunity for spiritual growth and appropriate for the participants. Human life, as ordinarily experienced, is an epic and dramatization of all the possibilities below the level of 600, at which point the context changes dramatically and a whole different set of seeming obstacles now presents itself as principles and challenges to awareness. At 600, perception is replaced by vision. What might have been seen as a misfortune in the world of perception might now be seen as a gift by the more advanced awareness of vision. Also, at 600, identification with the physical body ceases, and thus that great fear above all fears, death itself, disappears as a possible reality. Like a caterpillar emerging from its cocoon, the newly liberated spirit rejoices in its non-physicality, since the self is totally invisible. The levels over 600 can most accurately be described or referred to as a state or condition that is all-prevailing and self-evident, and there is neither subject nor object. The knower and the known are self-identical and self-evident as one and the same, without division. There is no inner or outer, no individual versus God, no part outside the whole, and no independent entity to account for. All the dualities have been transcended. The awareness is self-existent, so that there remains no individual to whom it has occurred. For a brief moment, as the self disappears into the self, there is a transitory amazement, an awe of profound proportion and depth. The death of the self is experienced, and then all is stillness and peace. That the body was ever considered to be me seems absurd and must have been due to a passing lapse and forgetfulness. It is as though one had mysteriously forgotten who one really was, and now, with joy, remembered. All the fears and vicissitudes of life disappear, and now, free of even death itself, there is the remembrance that one always has been and always will be, and that survival was never a problem at all. One's innate safety had been guaranteed all along by the reality of the self, which is all present and beyond time and space. No beginnings or endings are even possible, and one's reality existed before all worlds or universes. There are neither questions nor answers, because no dichotomy exists within identity. One is neither the one nor the many, but instead beyond all positionalities and mentations. It would be more accurate to say that one's self is the reality out of which the one and the many arise. All is self-complete, autonomous, and not in need of anything outside itself, since outside itself is an impossibility. Thus, self is context, whereas self is content. There is no division between creator and that which is created. All is self-creating, as the manifestation of the mind of God. This great awareness characterizes the consciousness level of the 700s, where self is all that is, because the universe is self-evolving and self-fulfilling. No intervention is necessary. All is in perfect balance and harmony. The consciousness levels of the 800s and 900s represent the highest levels of the potential consciousness of humanity. A sage may occasionally return to the world, but the world has now been transformed. It is no longer a world with individuals who need saving, but an energy field to lift and reinforce. Each consciousness in the world that calibrates above the level of integrity serves to counterbalance the negativity of the 78% of the population, which reflects negativity below the level of 200. The power of the consciousness level of 1000 counterbalances the total negativity of all mankind and creates not only the potentiality but also the certainty of the salvation of all humanity. Although this eventuality seems to unfold slowly in the world of time, it already exists in the reality of the absoluteness beyond time. Spiritual progress is based on acceptance as a matter of free will and choice, and thus everyone experiences only the world of their own choosing. The universe is totally free of victims, and all eventualities are the unfolding of inner choice and decision. What accounts for the apparent delay in this inevitable destiny? It appears to be the attraction of the energy fields that we have delineated as force or illusion and falsehood. Central to this attraction is the identification of self as the body and the survival feels that ensue. Death is then feared as the end of life and is perceived as a self-existent, possible reality that has a fearsome imaginary existence. To the higher self, human life is composed of games and charades because unconsciously everyone knows that death is not an actual possibility. Why else would anybody risk their life for political gain or money? Even at a brief glimpse, the history of mangled bodies convinces any would-be hero that the glory of war is a total absurdity. After a war where 70 million people die, the country's borders remain the same. Business returns to usual, and the whole charade is a sad joke. Former enemies now shake hands, observe each other's memorial days, and visit each other's war memorials. In the game of chess or checkers, the pieces are not destroyed, but merely moved off the board for another day. The ego engages in performances that are utterly convincing to the players and onlookers. On a certain level, each player is providing a spiritual service to others by acting out the lessons that need to be learned for the benefit of all. Acts of courage awaken the soul to its own innate power, which it will need to reach the ultimate awareness. Beyond the 600s, there is no personal self to make choices. Progression is an expression of the nature of consciousness itself. The commitment to a specific spiritual task does therefore keep the body running on in the material world until the project is completed. There is in reality only one lifetime that has the appearance of successive chapters. And there we are. That was chapter 4, I believe I just read. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I shall soon be reading chapter 5, and I hope you join me. Do take care and much love.